Aging affects everyone in human population. My laboratory is specifically interested how aging affect metabolism and more importantly, whether we can target these changes in order to extend health and lifespan. We found that methionine metabolism is the most affected metabolic pathway with aging. Other groups showed that methionine levels are abnormally high or associated with different diseases, including cardiovascular diseases, mild cognitive impairment, and diabetes. Methane restriction delays aging and extends lifespan across all different species tested. The big problem is decreasing levels of methane in the diet because it has a very bad taste. It's a big question in the field. So if we can find a way how we can translate methane restriction into humans, then we can find a way how we can delay aging for everyone.